memory and monarchy, two M's that go together. I'm going to come on to the coronation, but I want to begin with some reflections on monarchy and memory, because certainly those of us who live in monarchies, and I appreciate not many of you do here, but those of us who do live our lives through kings and queens, and of course you did in Austria for a long time. We've got Rudolf up there, and the Habsburgs, who I will come back to in a sense, are still deeply, deeply ingrained in Austrian culture. We grow up with our kings and queens, we grow old with them. King Charles III, who's going to be crowned in just over 7 weeks on the 6th of May, is almost my contemporary. He's a little bit older than me, I hasten to say, but I grew up with him. I witnessed his schooling. I reported on his fairy tale but doomed wedding, which you'll all remember, to Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1981, when I was a journalist on the Times covering it. I have discussed environmental matters with him quite a lot. I've met him on a number of occasions. We've had deep discussions, not quite as deep as I had with his wonderful father, who I once sat up with at Balmoral till 3 a.m. discussing Christianity and the environment. And I now find myself writing a book prior to the coronation. This book is coming out next week, God Save the King, which is about the sacred dimension of monarchy, but particularly looking forward to Charles's coronation. And much of the appeal about monarchy is an appeal to memory, I think. National memory, folk memory, family memory. People 5 or so years older than me will have vivid memories of the last British coronation. I imagine you might, 70 years ago this June, sorry. I vividly remember the first time I ever watched television, which was gathered in a family friend's house to see the wedding of Queen Elizabeth, the late Queen Elizabeth's sister Margaret, and Anthony Armstrong-Jones, another doomed marriage as it turned out, but I can remember us all, we didn't have a television then, gathered round, and for a long time it was these occasions that brought us together. And for me and my family, my parents, central to every Christmas day is the ritual of sitting down at 3 o'clock, the sacred hour, 3 o'clock on Christmas Day, for the monarch's broadcast. And of course, for virtually all of my life, it's been the late Queen's broadcast. I've written a lot about the significance of the broadcast and its increasingly Christian theme. And of course, we had the first broadcast by King Charles last Christmas, which again very much picked up the Christian theme of the Queen's broadcast. And monarchy is also, of course, about place. This conference is about memory and place. And monarchy is particularly about place, nations, palaces, churches. I've written about how the very high proportion of the occasions on which the British monarch appears publicly are religious occasions. Going to church, the late Queen, of course, went to church every single Sunday. She was a very much more devoted churchgoer than her subjects, and she was often photographed going to church, particularly in Scotland at Crathy, in Sandringham. I've had the honour of preaching to her at Crathy Church, and but we also see the monarch, particularly at national services of Thanksgiving. I mean, the service of remembrance that you referenced, the national service of remembrance, of course, royal weddings, royal funerals, and we'll come on to that later. Monarchy is above all visual. The Queen famously said, we have to be seen to be believed. And monarchy is about spectacle and mystery and magic and sparkle, and it thrives on pageantry and colour. And it lends itself, of course, to television and to film. And there are hundreds of films about royalty, as we know, both fictional and documentary. As it happens, when I left my hometown of St Andrews a couple of days ago, the town is full of massive film crews because Netflix is filming the last series of The Crown. I'm sure you're all addicted to it. Probably the most popular ever Netflix series, not necessarily particularly truthful, but fascinating. And they are filming, as we speak, today and all this week and all last week, the episode in the last series, which will be about Prince William meeting Kate. As I'm sure you all know, they met in our university, St Andrews, I may say. Prince William never darkened the doors of the chapel. I speak as a university chaplain, and we rather hoped he might appear in chapel. He never appeared in chapel. He appeared a great deal at Tesco's and on the tennis courts. But anyway, the interesting twist of that, this is nothing whatsoever to do with theology and film, but you'll be very interested to know. You probably all know that William first encountered Kate at a fashion show when she was rather scantily dressed, and I'm sure this has gone right round the world. The Netflix have tweaked the first meeting so that it's actually when Kate is seen jogging along the pier in St Andrews, and William sees her and takes a fancy to her. They've erased the fashion show, perhaps rightly. And so we now have this wonderful scene, which I actually watched being filmed last Thursday, of Kate jogging along the pier with William pursuing her. So anyway, that's by the by. I want to talk about the way that film and documentary film captures the sense of both memory and place in monarchy and its sacred aspects. And I want to begin here in Wien with footage of the funeral of the Emperor Franz Josef, König und Kaiser, that wonderful figure who's obsessed me all my life. Like Elizabeth II, he'd reigned, of course, for very nearly 70 years in his case, from 1848 until 1916. Extraordinary figure, tragic, solitary, ascetic. Any of you who've been to Bad Ischl, to the Kaiser Villa, will know that extraordinary little metal bed that he slept on all his life. Devout, with that extraordinary relationship with his mistress, Katharina Schratt, who of course was set up for him by Sisi, by Elizabeth. Now, this archive footage, some of you will know this, it's fairly accessible. I watched it yesterday. Let me commend to you, if you haven't been, the wonderful museum in the Central Friedrichshof here about death and funerals. We've been talking a lot about death today. It is the only museum in the world that I know of which focuses on death, and it's absolutely wonderful. Vienna has a love affair with death. You discover this when you go into the museum. They tell you that we are in love with, and wonderful thing to be in love with. And it's a marvelous museum, but it has footage. This footage that you're going to see is there, footage of the Empress Zita, of course, the last ever Habsburg Empress's funeral, of Otto, Archduke Otto, in 2011. It's a fascinating museum. But this bit of footage is, of course, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire is already beginning to break apart. It's 1916, the First World War started, it's post-Sarajevo, and yet there's a very 19th century flavour to this film, I think. Rank upon rank of soldiers from right across the empire in their uniforms, women in black veils, the hearse pulled by wonderful plumed horses. What memories that procession through Wien must have evoked as it made its way from the Hofburg. And the religious sense, of course, deeply sacred occasion, and this point's already been made this morning, I think, in terms of what you were saying about Ireland, actually, and even secular funerals have a kind of religious feel. But this, of course, was a very religious funeral, enhanced by the interesting soundtrack. This is, of course, silent film. And you will hear that put over it is plain chant, is Latin, or is religious chant. So let's see it. I love this Austrian phrase, which I only learnt yesterday in the museum, Trauenzug, which is the procession, the funeral procession. It's like a death train, Trauenzug. Here is Franz Josef's Trauenzug. And the memory, of course, of Franz Josef lingers. As you well know, I go a lot to Bad Ischl for the operetta there, and where he had his summer villa. And I've been twice on the day of the Kaiser's birthday, when, I don't know if any of you have been there, but a lookalike Franz Josef, an actor with the great mutton chop whiskers and in uniform with somebody representing Sisi, arrives on a steam train in Bad Ischl station and drives through the town town, and it is an extraordinary atmosphere. You see people reverentially bowing, you see people kneeling, you realize how much, and there's a service of remembrance in the Eschel Parish Church where Anton Bruckner was the organist. And of course, this is exactly what people did when the coffin bearing our late Queen travelled from Balmoral down to London. I was very struck, and when they're lying in state in Edinburgh and London, people would cross themselves, people would bow, essentially religious attitudes. Now, I'm not in the business here of canvassing the reinstatement of the Habsburgs, I hasten to say, but I'm conscious they still evoke incredibly powerful memories here, and a sense of place. And the funerals of monarchs, of course, are particularly evocative from the point of view of memory, because they remind us of our own mortality. I've just, as it happens, finished writing 3 books about aspects of death, and the last one of which is about Victorian views of heaven. And of course, Queen Victoria herself was obsessed with death and with excessive, in many people's views, grieving and mourning, particularly for her beloved German husband, Albert, and she established the whole tradition of holding an annual memorial service to the husband. But let's fast forward from 50 years from Queen Victoria's death, just 37 years after Franz Joseph's funeral, to the coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953, the last great coronation. Of course, the United Kingdom is the only country now in Europe which still has coronation services for its monarchs. Every other European monarchy has abandoned them. Norway was the last one to do so. We are the only one that still has a coronation service, which is a Christian service of worship framed within the context of a celebration of communion, always in Westminster Abbey. And we're building up to the first one for 70 years on May the 6th with Charles III. Elizabeth's lasted 3 hours and 8,000 people were in Westminster Abbey. We're told that this one is going to be much shorter and smaller. Very interesting to know what's going to disappear. I've just written an article for the Catholic magazine, The Tablet, trying to predict what's going to happen, but that's not where we're here for now. Coronations epitomize the sacred nature of monarchy, their religious services before anything else. And of course, at them, the monarch is set aside, anointed, consecrated, in many ways like a priest or a bishop would be, and the garments worn by the monarch are deliberately modelled on priest's vestments and episcopal vestments. Left-wing sociologists coming from the far left of the Labour Party described the 1953 coronation as a national act of communion, and there's extraordinary writing about the 1953 coronation, not just from people you might expect from monarchists and people on the political right, but people on the political left who saw it as an amazing binding together of the country in a kind of shared memory. Whether this is going to happen in May is difficult to know. Franz Joseph's funeral, and you could see it from there, was all about soldiers. It was very military. The coronation, our coronations, are really all about the church. And in this little clip, you're going to see lots of clergy. Takes place, of course, in Westminster Abbey, where every coronation of an English and then a UK monarch has since 1066. Directly modelled, of course, on the crowning of the kings of Israel. I hope if we've got the right bit here, that I think I got the right bit and sent it to Mila, this is going to be the anointing done under a canopy, the only bit that you don't see. The television cameras probably again will not be allowed to film it in May. We saw the Queen under the canopy, and that was when the anointing took place. As I'm sure you know, the oil for Charles's anointing has just been made and blessed in Jerusalem with oil from olive groves on the Mount of Olives, including the monastery where Prince Philip's mother was nun, because she was, of course, a Greek Orthodox nun, and it was consecrated a couple of weeks ago by the Patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem. I'm predicting that there will be quite a significant Orthodox element in Charles's coronation. Charles, as you know, is very interested in orthodoxy, and I've just been writing about this. I mean, it'll be a much more ecumenical coronation than the Queen's was, but I think there will be Orthodox participation. So above all, the coronation is a piece of theatre. And of course, it is absolutely made for television. On that little table, I'm sorry, you come and have a look at it, is my little visual aid, which is the Queen in her, I mean, you can come and wander around. I don't know whether you've got a picture of it you can put up, Mina. Mina photographed it, and I've got a television camera. The cameraman, I'm afraid, has gone to meet his maker. He's legless, literally legless. And I have a lovely little set of coronation figures from home, and I brought these out. I thought they might be impounded at London Heathrow or Vienna. Ah, there we are. There she is. There's the old cameraman. He's still got his legs on there. And the Archbishop of Canterbury with the crown. I just want to say a word finally. The coronation, of course, is all about symbolism. It's all about medieval regalia which symbolize different values, and I am very worried that in stripping things away to make things very short and very modern, we may lose a lot of the symbolism of the regalia. I just want to talk about one symbol which is very dear to my heart from Scotland, which is the Stone of Destiny, the Stone of Scone, on which the monarch will be seated. This throne, which is called St. Edward's throne, actually built by Edward I, who stole the Stone of Scone from Scotland, famously, the hammer of the Scots, and it was in Westminster Abbey until it was abducted by some Scottish nationalist students in 1950, and is now back in Scotland and will come down from the coronation, although various prominent members of the Scottish National Party, including the blessed Alex Salmond, who was our leader for a long time, have said that Scotland shouldn't release it. So it's quite a hot political issue. But let me just say a little bit about the Stone of Destiny, because I think it's very, very interesting in terms of memory and place. Since 1307, every English sovereign, with the exception of Mary I and Mary II, has been anointed and crowned while sitting on that chair which was built to accommodate the Stone of Scone. As I say, Edward I looted it from Scone Abbey in Perth in 1296, and before then it had played a key role in the crowning of every Scottish king for at least 400 years, so it's been used for well over 1,000 years. As I say, it was abducted by Scottish nationalists in 1950, and they removed the stone from Westminster Abbey, only for it to crash on the floor and break into two, so it's actually now in two bits. Loaded the pieces onto an old Ford Anglia car, and there were actually roadblocks erected on the Anglo-Scottish border to try and the first time ever that the Anglo-Scottish border was closed was when they'd stolen the Stone of Scone, but they ended up burying it in a wood in Kent in the south of England for several weeks and then driving it back to Scotland. As they crossed the border, they pulled back the coat that covered the stone, poured whiskey over it and said, "We're signifying its return to the Celtic people." It was wrapped in a saltire. It was left in the ruins of Arbroath Abbey, which is a ruined abbey on the east coast of Scotland, where a declaration had been, famous declaration signed to ask the Pope to recognise Scottish independence in the Middle Ages. It then came back to Westminster Abbey. In 1996, the UK government decreed it should finally be returned to Scotland, with the understanding it would be brought back to London for coronations, which is what we think will happen. It's now in Edinburgh Castle. It's going to be from next year in a new museum in Perth. Now, it's a relatively insignificant bit of red sandstone, cracked through the middle as a result of its abduction, and it's got an extraordinary backstory, legendary history. The story is that it is the pillar on which Jacob slept when he had his famous dream of the ladder going up to heaven, described in Genesis 28. And you'll all remember this, I'm sure. The biblical story recounts that he rose early in the morning, he took the stone that he'd put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. and he called the place where God had delivered his promise to the descendants of Abraham Bethel. And many years later, God told Jacob to return to Bethel, where he renamed him Israel. And again, Jacob set up this stone as a pillar. Some stories also identify it as the pillar where Abimelech was crowned the king of Israel and Josiah made his covenant with the Lord to keep his commandments. Now, the next episode in this extraordinary story of the Stone of Scone has the stone being taken away from Israel through Egypt. The various versions of the story. One recounts that around 580 before the birth of Christ, when the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar were invading Israel, the prophet Jeremiah and the daughter of King Zedekiah, Tia, who was the last survivor of the Davidic line, smuggled the stone out of Israel so it wouldn't fall into the hands of the Babylonians. They first went to Egypt as guests of the Pharaoh, and then via Spain to Ireland, where Tia married an Irish king and took the name Scota. Another version of the story says the stone remained in Egypt for some time, where it became the property of the pharaohs, and Scota was one of Pharaoh's daughters who subsequently, and it came to Ireland through one of her descendants, Simon Breck. Now, this ties up with the idea that the Scots are the descendants of the lost tribe of Dan, and it's a fascinating and very murky area which we could spend hours on. So it ends up in Ireland, where it acquires the name of the Lia Fail, the Stone of Destiny, said to have been on the sacred hill of Tara, where the Irish high kings were crowned, and a piece of it was broken off and taken to the Irish colony of Dalriada in the west of Scotland, possibly by St. Columba. Some stories suggest Columba used the stone as his pillow, and it resided on the sacred island of Iona for a time, then on the hill of Dunad, where it might have been used for the crowning of Dalriadan kings. And it is possible that the first ever Christian consecration of a monarch in Europe, anywhere in Europe, took place either on Iona or Dunad. Davnan's Life of Columba suggests Columba did this. It would be before any other European Christian inauguration of a monarch. So it may tie in with that. It was then removed via a castle in the west of Scotland to Scone in Perthshire in the centre of Scotland, the new capital of the United Kingdom of the Picts and Scots, and it was there used for Scottish kings to be enthroned on. As I say, they sat rather uncomfortable place to be enthroned on, or uncomfortable royal seat. Edward, the last Scottish king to be crowned there was John Balliol. Edward, as I see, seized it as part of his bid to annex the Scottish crown to that of England. Now, it's actually extremely dubious, extremely unlikely that the stone on which Charles will be crowned ever came from the Holy Land. The sandstone of which it's made is relatively common in Scone and Staffnage. It's totally unknown in Ireland, in Tara, or in the Middle East. So I'm afraid we're probably dealing with complete fiction here, but it's an area where facts are much less important than legend. It symbolises the sacred character of monarchy, the history of the monarchy in the British Isles, and it's a wonderful kind of link, I think, to biblical times. I'm going to stop there. We're running a bit late anyway, but I'll stop. But I mean, I could talk a lot about the orb, the sceptre, the significance of what to many people is sort of medieval mumbo-jumbo with which Charles may or may not be invested. I think they are going to cut down. You can see the rod and the sceptre based on my rod and staff, as in Psalm 23, symbolizing virtue, justice, peace. And one of the big questions will be how much of this will be retained in the coronation. But this, of course, Elizabeth's coronation, just to reflect, is far longer ago for us 70 years than Franz Joseph's funeral was for people who attended, who were at that coronation. We're talking about a much longer time span between now, when we'll have our next coronation, 2023, and 1953, than there was between the Queen's coronation and Franz Joseph's funeral. But I suppose my point is here, the memory is important, the place is important, and it is a gift to filmmakers, whether they are documentary filmmakers or like The Crown, not quite so bothered about factual accuracy. It'll be very interesting to see what is made of the Charles's coronation. I mean, we know it'll be superbly covered by the BBC, but how it develops into cinematography.